Well, hello, everyone, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to Unheard Stories. I am Lubna Hassaniya, and I come to you from spectacular Southern California. My guest today, Mr. Dalton Einhorn, will be sharing with us fascinating unheard stories from the life of Gibran Kahlil Gibran. I would like to start by welcoming the dignitaries sitting on the call with us. We have His Excellency Gabriel Isa, former ambassador of Lebanon to the United States, His Excellency Jean Macaron, former ambassador of Lebanon to Kuwait. We have Councillor Mirna Khawli, former Consul General of Lebanon to LA, Councillor Ghassan Abdel Khaliq, former Chargé d'Affaires of Lebanon in India, Honorary Consul of Lebanon for the Greater Cleveland area, Mr. Anthony Asher. I would also like to welcome Honorable Judge Tony Raphael and Sarah Diligenti, Executive Director at Alliance Française de Washington. We have a very special guest with us today, Princess Hayat Arslan. Thank you, Princess, for honoring us with your presence. We appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. I must confess, it was not an easy task to prepare for today's event. Having to relive the life of Gibran, to reacquaint myself with this man whose words resonate into eternity, the purest of the human expression, whose soul, ever so kind and loving, embodies a timeless wisdom, and whose mind captures the essence of being. Gibran is massive. He once confessed that the most massive characters are seared with scars. Reflecting back on his life, one can easily pick on the many struggles he was afflicted with. He was born into a poor family, perhaps during the worst era in the history of the Middle East, when the Ottoman Empire pulverized the land and its people, and later France and Britain divided up the region like a cake to be devoured. He confessed to Mary, quote, "My father hurt me often," unquote. His younger sister died of tuberculosis at the age of 14. Less than a year later, his mother and brother died 4 weeks apart. He was seldom in good health himself and mostly struggled to make ends meet. But these are the tribulations of life that inexorably and to variable degrees strain many of us. Gibran endured even deeper pains like social isolation and depression, from which emerged undaunted the clarity of his mind and the purity of his soul. He urged people to be free in thoughts through dreams and imaginations. In one of his letters to Mary Haskell, he wrote, quote, "Imagination sees the complete reality. It's where past, present, and future meet," unquote. He called on others to remove themselves from dogmas and not to be slaves of the old. In 1913, he wrote to Mary Haskell, quote, "The children of yesterday cannot hear the songs of today, nor those of tomorrow. To them, the laws of the past are the laws of the future. They live in the past. They eat, drink, and sleep with the past. They dream the dreams of the dead. I pity them," unquote. He had a fervent desire for life. "I do not want to be just a painter of pictures or a writer of poems. I want to be more," he once wrote. He knew what life demands of us and thus wrote to Mary saying, "There is no peace in the art of being." In his letter on August 14, 1912, he wrote, quote, "The great storm for which I have been waiting has just come. Mary, what is there in a storm that moves me so? Why am I so much better and stronger and more certain of life while a storm is passing?" Unquote. This massive character who existed from all eternity and shall exist till the end of time, and these are his words, was described in Mary's diaries as, quote, "He is as silent as a tree, his movements gentle as the leaves." My guest today, Dalton Einhorn, will help us understand who the real Gibran Kahlil Gibran was and what role Mary Elizabeth Haskell played in his adult life. Mr. Einhorn is the editor of an ongoing series of books emerging from the largest known collection of unpublished materials of Gibran, the Mary Elizabeth Haskell Minus Papers at the University of North Carolina. He already released the book, Beloved Prophet 2020, as well as the book, And the Prophet Said. His book, Kahlil Gibran's Book of Lebanon and Syria, will be available later this year. And next year, just in time for the centennial anniversary of Gibran's masterpiece, The Birth of the Prophet, will be released. Without further ado, let's meet our guest. Hello, Dalton. How are you today? Welcome to Unheard Stories.
Oh, that was a fantastic introduction. And now I hope I can keep up with you.
Yes.
Thank you. And just for the record, I'm based outside of Boston. So I'm 45 minutes from where Kahlil walked the streets as a little boy after they moved to Boston in 1895. So just to place in context where I am physically in relation to Kahlil.
Thank you for being with us, Dalton. You are so passionate about Gibran. You are immersed in his life story, in his writings and his letters. When and how were you introduced to the world of Gibran Kahlil Gibran? And how did you obtain an exclusive license to publish his work?
So like a lot of other people, I was introduced to Kahlil through a parent, through my mother. But unlike a lot of other people, I can say that I was introduced to my mother through Kahlil Gibran. So I have a very unusual story. So as I mentioned, my mother was the beginning of the beginning for me. She was a book editor at a major New York publishing house called Harper Brothers. And she was one of the few book editors in the entire industry. And she was the kind of person who everyone said she knew everybody and everybody knew her. And around 1966, she heard a rumor that there was a massive discovery of thousands of pages of letters and journals belonging to Kahlil Gibran and a woman named Mary Haskell at the University of North Carolina. And she paid very close attention because at the time, in 1966, Kahlil's book, The Prophet, was selling 7,000 copies a week in the United States. And it was read on every major campus in the country. So she wanted in.
Mm-hmm.
And so she found out who this was representing these papers. She found an agent in New York City. And she basically stalked him and said, whatever you're doing, I want to be the editor. And she was very forceful and very charming. And he said, well, you know, it'd be very interesting to have you be the editor. You seem to have some good ideas, but I can't hire you. So if you want to get hired, you have to be approved by the representatives of the Gibran estate, who at the time were up in Boston, and it was Mariana Gibran. And her advisor was Justice Elias Shamon, who was the first Lebanese judge in the United States. So the agent said, you'll have to go up there and prove to them that you're worthy of this project. So my mother went up to Boston, not far from where I am. She met in Justice Shamon's offices with Mariana and Judge Shamon. And when they sat down, my mother leaned forward and in perfect Arabic said she wanted the job.
Uh-huh.
And their jaws fell open.
Yeah.
Because it turns out she was one of only a few female editors in the industry, but she was the only one whose parents were born in Damascus, and where in her childhood home, they spoke Arabic, not English.
Mm-hmm.
So this blew them away, and she was hired on the spot. So my mother was told about these materials. She read them. We'll talk about them a little bit, but it's sort of 12,000 pages of everything, of letters, of journals describing this relationship between Kahlil and a woman named Mary Haskell that no one had heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
And so she conceived that she would create a book that would tell the story of the real Kahlil Gibran in his own words, coming from letters he wrote to Mary and quotes that she wrote down from their meetings. And she would also introduce Mary as well. So in 1968, January 1968, my mother takes a sabbatical to start editing these materials. And this is where I come in, because I was born in October 1968. So you can kind of figure where I was at the editing table. So, who knows? I maybe absorbed all of this through. So that's where my involvement begins. The story changes a little bit. And in 1971, the editing is underway when my mother receives a cancer diagnosis. And this would be the cancer that kills her young. She rushes to finish Beloved Prophet and gets that done in 1972. And then she dies shortly after that. Now, after she died, there was an absence of her in my house growing up. I mean, for whatever reasons, my father refused to talk about her again. And years later, we're talking decades, I went in search of who she was. I wanted to really know who she was. And so I contacted some of her friends and some of her relatives. But I knew her life was all about books. And I knew there was one book that seemed to be more important than any others. And it was Beloved Prophet, about this Lebanese poet, Kahlil Gibran. I was surrounded by the books in my house. And so I started a process to find out what happened to that book. And it took me to the original publisher, Knopf, which was the publisher of Kahlil's books. That led me to meeting somebody who knew my mother and the idea that, well, could you bring it back? What a way to honor her. And so I thought that was the end of my story, or that was the beginning of the story. So my role in all of this is get her book back to honor her. Wrong, that was the beginning. So we worked hard and we found out that they couldn't bring the book back. It just wouldn't make sense with most of Kahlil's copyrights expiring. But they worked with me and said, we could help you bring this book back on your own, and we'll tell you how to do that. And there's a lot of rights, laws, and copyrights and all of that. That's really hard. But based on what they started with me, I spent 7 years, and I finally became the second person ever to get the permissions to publish from the University of North Carolina, my mother being the first.
Yes.
So here we are now. What started with bringing my mother back, I realized after sitting with these thousands and thousands of pages, there were books and books waiting to be published. And what she did was the tip of the iceberg. So I brought back her book, Beloved Prophet 2020. And then, that's going to be just the beginning. The other book you mentioned, And the Prophet Said, turns out Kahlil had a book that he was working on at the time of his death. It was probably going to be like The Madman. Never got it out. So that was the book waiting to go. And now we have more coming up.
Yes.
That's my story and how I got involved.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing it with us. And to clarify, Mariana is Gibran's sister.
Yes.
But your mom never got to meet Mary Haskell, because it was after the fact, after she had passed.
Yeah, Mary died in 1964, and she had Alzheimer's disease at the end of her life. So probably about 1962, 1963 were kind of rough years for her. So she never met Mary, but she did meet Mariana. And the great thing about meeting Mariana is she confirmed everything in the University of North Carolina archives was real. And if anything, Mary's role in Kahlil's life was even bigger than what the materials themselves said.
Yes. Yes. Well, these archives with all these handwritten materials, basically they're journals and letters, they're absolutely priceless. They represent a significant part of Gibran's literary legacy. They span 27 years of his adult life. Can you describe to us physically what these archives contain, and how did they end up at UNC?
Okay, so physically what the archives contain is 615 letters between the two of them from about 1908 to 1931. 325 of them are Kahlil's, and 290 of them are Mary's. The average letter from Kahlil to Mary was about 1 page. It was very short. The average letter from Mary to Kahlil was about 10 to 20 pages. So she would go on and on and on. So if you actually put them side by side, there are many folders that are Mary's, just a few folders that are Kahlil's. But I think the gold in there is was no one who spent more time with Kahlil in his adult life than Mary. And he shared more with her than with any other person. And Mary had kind of a photographic memory. She would write down everything they talked about in their conversations in journal books. And there are 27 of these. And these have a few thousand pages in which Kahlil is quoted about literally every aspect of his life, from Lebanon, his childhood, to his art career, and to the creation of the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
So these archives are there in a big kind of old-fashioned domed library on a university campus. But their story, how they got there, is completely unexpected, and it's miraculous, and it's part of the fun of all of this. So the collection where they are, it's called the Southern Historical Collection of the University of North Carolina. And a woman named Mary Haskell made a big donation to the library in 1960. And this was not a big surprise to them. This was a library dedicated to chronicling the history of the Southern United States. Mary's husband, J. Florence Minus, was a very well-known businessman in the South, and his family was well-known as well. And also Mary's father had a unique distinction. When the Civil War ended in the United States, Robert E. Lee was spared the indignity of signing over the Confederate Army to the Union Army. General Alexander Chiefs Haskell was nominated by Robert E. Lee to sign the surrender papers. So I think this is what they were expecting when this woman made this big donation. So then they get these materials, and it's crate after crate after crate, and they send this woman named Jane Atkins, who's a young librarian, in, and they tell her, okay, Jane, we want you to write down everything that's in there. So she must have been miserable because it was going to take forever. There's so many things. And to make even worse, she grabs a box, it's dusty. She takes it into a windowless room with fluorescent lighting. She puts the box down, she brushes the dust off, takes off the top. She looks inside, and there's a letter. And the letter says something like, Mary, do you know what it is to burn, and while burning, freeing yourself? Let me cry out with all of the voices in me that I love you. Signed, Kahlil, with love from Kahlil. She has no idea, what is this? And she looks, the envelope is there too. Kahlil Gibran, 51 East 10th Street, New York City. And then she finds another letter, and another letter, and another letter. And all of a sudden, Jane Atkins is the first person in the world to know that this woman no one's ever heard of, Mary Haskell, had a 27-year loving relationship with Kahlil. And she was more than just his closest friend. She was his soulmate. She was his inspiration. She was his editor. She was everything to him. So they find all of these materials completely unexpected. There was only one person at the time who actually knew of Mary's role in Kahlil's life, and it was Mariana. So it was a real shock that, but that's how they got. And it's clear that Mary intended them to be found because she was keeping the secret all of her life, and she wanted to know the world, to know the Kahlil she knew.
Yeah.
So that's how the materials get there.
Are they well preserved?
So if you've ever been to like a university library and been into the stacks, that's kind of how they are. You have to request them. You have to get a researcher's identification and permissions to go there. You set up an appointment. They will bring them to you in sort of one box at a time. The boxes are about 2 feet long, about 18 inches high, and about 6 inches wide. And they will hand you one box. You can take that to a table, and you are kind of encouraged to take out one page at a time from this box. But it's not a case where you have to wear gloves or anything like that. And in a way it should be, because when I was there at UNC and going through the boxes, and I looked, and there in black ink, in Kahlil's handwriting, is the first draft of the Prophet, written when he was on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in May and June 1918. So it should be, and it's almost like it should be in glass. But you know, in a way, maybe it's poetic because it's there for everybody, just like the Prophet is.
Yes. And just to give our audience a glimpse of what was going on between them, he always signed his letters, "May God keep you, beloved Mary," and may God fill your heart with his sweet songs. And I find that very sweet.
Yeah, may God enfold you in his blessed wings. I mean, these were great letters.
Yes, they indeed were. Your mother, Virginia Hilu, you said in 1972 published Beloved Prophet. It's all text taken or drawn from the archives at UNC. Now in 2020, you republished the same book. You entitled it Beloved Prophet 2020. You made some changes to your mother's version. What is in your mother's book, The Beloved Prophet, and how impactful was it at the time when it was released? And what compelled you after 50 years to put it out there again?
So when I started doing research on who my mother was, I started off with Beloved Prophet, and I talked to a few historians. Suhail Bashrui, basically, I think he's one of the best known historians, and he told me, your mother's book rewrote everything. Mm-hmm. Everything that was known about Gibran up till that point was kind of written by people who didn't know him, but they claimed they did. Mm-hmm. And your mother's book has become the book quoted by every single Gibran biography since then. So it was really exciting to know what the impact meant in terms of the understanding of Kahlil's life and his legacy. I also met a few people who knew my mother and a few other people along the way, and they just said it was a lovely book. It's a wonderful love story. Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful to know what can happen for a man of incredible young talent when someone sees the best in them. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot in terms of impact that resonated with me. But so when I found out what happened to my mother's book, it turns out that it was in print from 1972 until 1981. And the people at NOF told me that printing stopped around then because there were a series of lawsuits among all of the people claiming to be entitled to royalties from Gibran's estate. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of printing was paused by Knopf of his books. When everything was settled and Knopf restarted the printing, they forgot about her book. They just didn't bring it back. And so it sat there. And when I started getting in touch with the people at Knopf and they told me this information, I said, well, can you just bring it back thinking story one, or my mission is to get her book back in print. They said, well, we can't do that. But I did make it a mission to bring it back, but I was going to do it a little bit differently. The book as written, you really have to love Kahlil and Mary to read all 450 pages. I mean, there's only so many times you can hear them tell each other, I love you. You're wonderful. You're special. Your writing is amazing. Your art is fantastic. So I thought, okay, well, we know they loved each other, so I can trim some of that out. Also, my mother was kind of gossipy, and she really liked when they gossiped. So she put a lot of things in there that were actually kind of funny, but probably too much. So the idea that I had is that there was a whole generation of people who loved Kahlil and would love this book, but they just didn't want to pay the price of reading 450 pages. Mm-hmm. So I brought it back as a book about 60% as long as her book. The only thing that is different is I added a brief introduction, but otherwise everything is hers, just reduced.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for sharing that with us. These archives we're talking about, and Beloved Prophet, your mother's book, they revolutionized the way Gibran was portrayed at the time. But equally so, they revealed to us the identity of the woman whom he called his muse, right? Mary Haskell. On January 26, 1912, he sent Mary Haskell a marked copy of The Broken Wings, Al-Ajniha Al-Mutakassira, which he wrote in Arabic. He dedicated that book to her, saying, and I'm going to read his dedication. It says, إلى التي تحدق إلى الشمس بأجفان جامدة وتقبض على النار بأصابع غير مرتعشة وتسمع نغمة الروح الكلي من وراء ضجيج العميان وصراخهم. إلى MEH أرفع هذا الكتاب جبران. So he included, this was his dedication of the book, and he included a handwritten translation of that dedication on top, saying, "To her who gazes at the sun with fixed eyes, who touches the fire with fingers that tremble not, who hears the songs of the absolute while in the midst of the hollering blind. To MEH, I dedicate this book, Gibran." She received it on January 28th and wrote back saying, quote, "God lends me his heart to love you with. I asked for it when I found my own was too small, and it really holds you and leaves you room to grow," unquote. The question to you, Dalton, is, can you help us understand who Mary Haskell was, how the two met, and how did her role become so pivotal in his life?
Mary was an amazing woman, and I'll read you something in a bit. So remember that MEH, because she repays him the favor. She was way ahead of her time. She was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and moved to Boston to set up a school for girls with her sister. And Mary was unlike anybody else around. She was a feminist before there was feminism. She taught the girls how to drive. She was a genius. She could recall literature and poems by memory. She was endlessly curious. And so anytime Kahlil mentioned something, it became a passion of hers. And so in Mary, Kahlil had somebody with a mind that was a fire just like his. And I think that's one of the things that he recognized in her that made her a soulmate. She had a passion for life, knowledge, truth, and that was important, truth. They both sought the essential truths together. And so they challenged each other in wonderful ways, always making each other better. And she happened to meet him by happenstance. Right, so this woman who becomes the most important person in Kahlil's adult life was encouraged by a friend to attend an art exhibit in a small studio in Boston in 1904. And at this exhibit is 21-year-old Kahlil. And she notices there's something a little different about him. And they start talking about his unusual artwork. And you can imagine in patrician Boston, Kahlil's artwork, which had unusual themes of mythology and of maternal love, and really of the gods themselves, drew her. And so from this, she got more and more interested in not just who he was, but where he was going. And Mary was remarkable because she, although she had money, she kept none of it for herself. She always felt money should be used for a purpose. And one of her greatest purposes was to get the best out of young people with talent. So she sponsored artists and authors and playwrights. And it soon seemed to her that this young man had artistic talent that was waiting to be furthered. And she got the idea that she would send him to Paris for a formal art education. And so because of Mary, who sees this talent in him and is charmed by him and wants to see him get better, that's how Kahlil ends up studying art in Paris through her sponsorship. So she's everything to him, from his sponsor to the inspiration for Almitra later.
Yes.
She's also somebody who came into Kahlil's life at the exact right time, because she would never let Kahlil give her anything less than his best. And if you think about Kahlil, you mentioned the rapid succession of the 3 deaths in his family. Mary comes in basically, and he's got nowhere to go. He has to paint. He has to get better, right? So she does not let him fall back. She pushes him forward. And I think that's who Mary was. She was a person who pushed everyone forward. And I think it is fair to say that without Mary Haskell, there is no Kahlil Gibran as we know him.
Mhm.
and there is likely no prophet. And I think that if you met Mary, she would take absolutely no credit.
Mhm.
She would just look at Kahlil and smile,
Yeah.
knowing that the greatness that she knew was in him
Mhm.
had gotten out and was seen by others. And she was completely dedicated to Kahlil's success without asking anything for herself.
Mhm.
So this is who Mary was, or an absolutely remarkable person. And it is miraculous that they met, but it's like they were destined to meet.
Yes, she was miraculous. And he actually said it. He wrote it down in a letter he sent to her. He said, "Three things in my life have done most for me: my mother, who let me alone; you," meaning Mary Haskell, "who had faith in me and in my work; and my father, who called out the fighter in me." She is definitely at the heart of the prophet, and we will be talking about that in a little while. Dalton Gibran, besides being the philosophical essayist, the novelist, the poet, the artist, and besides being the key figure in a movement that swept through Arabic literature at the time, early 20th century, it's perhaps the most difficult question I ask you today. Who was the real Gibran Kahlil Gibran?
We know that Mary, who knew him best,
Mm-hmm.
did not know all of Kahlil. And in the letters and in the journals at University of North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
we showed that this woman who would have accepted him for everything that he was and did not give him what he needed in order to tell her about his true past, the poverty that he grew up in, the relationship that he had with his father, which was difficult and kind of brutal. So he kind of fictionalized his background. And it's sad that he couldn't even reveal everything that there was with Mary. But what we see is Kahlil was he was a very interesting character because he was capable of writing the most beautiful things in order to inspire people, and really could tap into themes of love that would last as long as humans read the prophet. He was capable of that, but he was an introvert. He was very shy. He craved solitude. He loved sort of being free to work on his own. And sometimes he was exhausted by being around other people. So he had some contradictions. He truly did love people, and he was inspired by Christ to give wisdom. So he had this love affair with people, but he was not always among them. So this is kind of sounding a little familiar, like Al-Mustafa. So Kahlil was a lot of things, but what I would say is you could say he was an artist. You can say he was the author of the prophet. But really the most essential thing that you could say about Kahlil is he was Lebanese.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go through everything that's in this collection at University of North Carolina, there is nothing that describes him better than being a proud son of Lebanon. And he lived his life that way. So that's the truest thing about Kahlil, is he loved Lebanon and he loved the Lebanese. And one can only imagine that the prophet couldn't have been written unless he was on an island, Manhattan, thousands of miles from home, waiting to return. So if there's anything that I could say who is the real Kahlil, is he was Lebanese.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that with us. Since we started talking about the prophet, let's talk about that masterpiece. It's the best-selling book of the 20th century, 100 million copies sold worldwide and translated to 50 languages. What is the real story behind the prophet? When did he start conceiving of the idea, and when did he bring it to the public?
So Kahlil was very Christian, and he loved Christ. And so as a young boy, he was influenced by the way average people would seek out Christ, and he would talk to them about all of the essentials of life. And so Kahlil tells us that the first idea that he had for a book of wisdom was conceived in 1899 when he was a student in Beirut.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea for the prophet himself, he writes and he states, came from living his relationship with Mary. And really the prophet is their love lived
Mm-hmm.
in writing. And so, you know, the way they would engage each other, these two minds meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and they would talk about every aspect of life. And, you know, the way it sounds is often Mary would start the conversation with a question, which is really the style of
Mm-hmm.
the prophet. And as example, as early as 1914, Mary writes in her journal, "What is poetry?" I asked him again. And Kahlil responds, "An extension of vision, and music is an extension of hearing. And so it is with all arts." So this is how they talked. She would pose this question and listen to him talk about love, marriage, religion, work,
Mm-hmm.
everything. And so that was kind of the nature of it. And one might say, well, you know, how do we know this is true? Well, Kahlil himself said it. In 1918, when he was unveiling his first draft version to Mary, he
Mm-hmm.
said, "Do you notice how full these things are of what we have said in talking together sometimes years ago? There's nothing in them that doesn't come from our talks. Talking about them with you has made them clear to me. And one writes these things in order to find in Anthem his own higher self." So the Kahlil himself tells us the prophet is the embodiment of their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Kahlil, without a doubt, is Al-Mustafa. Manhattan, without a doubt, is Orpheus. And Mary is Almitra.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Um, uh, After the prophet, I mean, she wrote him the most loving letter when she received her first copy of the prophet. I don't have it with me. I'm sure you do, but maybe not now. But then she went and visited him, right, in New York after the prophet. And the prophet at the time was doing very well. And he confessed to her that there will be a second and a third book of the prophet. And he told her, quote, "The second book is being written with your spirit with me. Nobody could write the prophet without you."
Yeah.
Dalton, you are currently completing a book that will be available later this year. You entitled it Kahlil Gibran's Book of Lebanon and Syria. Tell us about that book, its composition, what era of his life does it span, and what will we learn from that book?
Yeah, so you gave a really nice overview of Kahlil's involvement in the movement to free Lebanon from Ottoman rule. And when I was watching the news a few months ago of the invasion of Ukraine, and I heard that this could disrupt the food supply for Lebanon, it's like something flashed in my mind. I knew in the materials that I had read, there were hundreds of pages that Kahlil had written or said something about Lebanon and Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went back to them, it's like in 1910 or 1912, when he wrote these, it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like they were written for 2022. It's a cry from the heart for Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I did is I went back through the materials and I found that there were contemporaneous accounts of all of these things that were going on in the Middle East at the time and in Lebanon. Everything from the Druze rebellion to the Yemeni rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, the loss of Libya by the Ottomans to Italy, the Balkan Wars, the Young Turks, the massacres in Beirut and in Damascus by the Ottomans. All of these things, they're in there. And he's talking about them as they happen. But it's not just a reporter's account. Kahlil was desperately involved trying to organize people to help achieve the independence of Lebanon, to try to influence political figures to act on behalf of the country. And so they largely represent the period of about 1910 until about 1925. They had started, Mary and Kahlil had started to fall out of touch by then. But really, there's a kind of an intense period of about 13 or 14 years that these materials represent. And in them, people will recognize Kahlil's total devotion to the independence of Lebanon. Mm. And so that's what it represents. And kind of sadly, by about 1926, when the state of Lebanon is established, Kahlil barely writes to Mary anymore. So we actually don't have a record of his reaction to that. Yes. But it's powerful when people see what he was thinking and doing. And really what he was doing is very important.
Yes. And he wanted to be on a mission to save, and these are his words, those who are still alive. In 1921, their relationship, him and Mary, started to change. And then in 1923, as The Prophet was released to the world, Mary Haskell was disappearing from his life. She decided to marry and move on, right? She went to Georgia. She came to him one last time. What was the purpose of her visit back then?
So Mary was about 50 years old, and she was exhausted from a lifetime of taking care of everybody else. And the woman who put everybody else first finally needed care. And she had been invited by the husband of her cousin who died to join him, living a life of luxury in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And she needed it. Mm-hmm. But she knew that if she moved there, it would be the end of her relationship with Kahlil. So she started talking about the invitation of this man to move south and to join her, kind of hoping that Kahlil would ask her to stay. But I think she knew Kahlil would say no. Kahlil knew that Mary deserved a life of comfort for everything that she had done for him. I mean, for those first 3 years in New York City, Mary funded him entirely. She was his soulmate, and she revealed everything to him, and he revealed everything he could to her. And at that point, he knew she was in trouble. Mm-hmm. And even though he knew it probably would end their relationship and he would lose the most important adult in his life, he encouraged her to go, telling her, he can provide for you, and I care about your happiness. Mm-hmm. And so Mary is sort of heartbroken, but understands it, moves south. And when, as you mentioned, The Prophet comes out, she writes him possibly the most loving letter ever written, talking about how the book will stand forever. And then the address on it is from Savannah, Georgia. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of heartbreaking. And then from there, if you read the materials very closely and you look at what happened to Kahlil's life, within 18 months of The Prophet being published, Kahlil suffers a physical and emotional breakdown. He leaves New York, he rents his apartment out to someone else, and he goes back to Boston, where Mariana tries to feed him and take care of him. And the record shows his literary output never matches what it was when he was with Mary. Mm-hmm. His artistic output isn't quite the same. So in a way, to save Mary, Kahlil sacrificed himself. And it's terribly sad. And the only way they could handle that is they sort of drifted apart in communications.
Yeah. And then he passes away in 1931. He was only 48 years old. How did she receive the news of his passing? And what role did she play in the story of Gibran after his death?
So Kahlil dies on April 10th, 1931, in a hospital in Greenwich Village, not far from where his studio was. Mm-hmm. A day later, Mary gets a telegram from Mariana Gibran. And it's a one-line telegram saying, Kahlil has died. And she roars back into Kahlil's death, so his next chapter of life, mm-hmm. with as much or even more energy than when he was alive. She races up to Boston and to New York. And the first thing she does is she makes sure that Mariana is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Mariana, in some of her own writing, refers to Mary as a sister.
Mm-hmm.
And she does everything she can to emotionally support Mariana and even some of Kahlil's friends who are sort of meeting her for the first time and have no idea who she is. She was giving again. And then came the business of handling Kahlil's estate. He had written a will in 1913, and he had a studio full of artwork, as well as artwork in many other places. And it was Mary who really worked with the attorneys and the accountants to try to tie everything together. And one of the things that was foremost on her mind is in Kahlil's will, it stated that all of his financial assets would go to Mariana. And she was a hawk. She made the accountants and the attorneys account for every single penny that was due Mariana to make sure she was okay. She donated some of Kahlil's artwork to the museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he had gone hundreds of times to look at all of the paintings. And so now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the greatest art galleries in the world, they have in their collection 5 of Gibran's sketches. So she made sure that Kahlil was in this great institution. But then comes the big act, the most generous act, which is Mary had received by Kahlil's will the contents of his studio in New York City. And she made sure everything that he lived among, everything that he created, was sent back to Lebanon, where they went to Marsarkas to become the contents, the majority of the contents of the Kahlil Gibran Museum. And she was so proud to do that. And she saw it as kind of her mission. So after Kahlil's body goes back in July 1931 from Providence, Rhode Island on an ocean liner that sailed off into the mist of a rainy day, like the ship with purple sails. A year later, she sends what people now see with Kahlil and among him today, the contents of his studio, his bed, his desk, his paintings, his writings, his books. And so Mary essentially made sure all of that got done. And then in the years after that, when people had some inquiries about the legacy of Kahlil Gibran, she took letters from people who wanted to know more about him. So after his death, Mary roared back in with all of her life until 1964 when she passed, and then she rejoined him again. I see a couple of questions here, and perhaps I can try to answer them. Was Gibran inspired by other women, such as Micheline, for instance? The answer is Kahlil was inspired by many people. And I think there can be an entire book written about the women who influenced Kahlil, as well as the men. But if we remember, the relationship that he had with Micheline was only for a few years, but there was a sort of, I think, a potential romantic relationship there, but it really was a friendship where he would seem to be inspired by her sort of spark and intensity. So I think Kahlil, the young Kahlil, was shaped by that. I don't know if he was inspired artistically by her, but he seemed to really kind of harmonize and synergize off of other people that he met during his life. And there are a lot of examples of that. And so people like, you might remember his friendship with Albert Pinkham Ryder, the artist, influenced him significantly. And he was honored to sketch him. And there were many of these people in the artistic and literary communities who influenced him. Did Mary take care of his health and well-being as much as she was concerned with his literature? First and foremost, Mary was concerned with Kahlil, full stop. And when you read Beloved Prophet or Beloved Prophet 2020, there's just a small amount of the information that's in there is about her pleading with Kahlil to take better care of himself, especially during 1917 when he was working on behalf of the Lebanon Syria Relief Committee. When she saw him, he had lost a lot of weight, and she was greatly concerned about his appearance. She was concerned about what he was eating, how much sleep he was getting, and the emotional exhaustion. And so all of their relationship was really about Mary's devotion to Kahlil, not just his artwork and his writing. What was the most significant letter that touched you in Gibran's letters? So there's one that I mentioned earlier that, to me, if you were to say, well, who is the real Kahlil Gibran? It's that he's Lebanese. And I pulled one letter that I thought illustrated what Kahlil thought about, what tore at him when he was in New York, when he couldn't do enough to help Lebanon. And so he wrote a letter to Mary, 1916. And if you remember contextually, the Allies had blockaded the Mediterranean to prevent the Ottoman Empire from receiving supplies. And Jamal Pasha then established his own blockade of Lebanon, and no aid could get there. At the same time that he did that, the Turkish army had seized crops from Mount Lebanon, and half the population living in Mount Lebanon died in the resulting famine. And so against that context, Kahlil wrote, "Beloved Mary, my people, the people of Mount Lebanon, are perishing through a famine which has been planned by the Turkish government. 80,000 already died. Thousands are dying every day. The same things that happened in Armenia are happening in Syria. Mount Lebanon, being a Christian country, is suffering the most. You can imagine, Mary, what I'm going through just now. I cannot sleep, nor eat, nor rest. All the Syrians here are being tortured in the same way. We're trying to do our best. We must save those who are still alive. Oh, Mary, it is too much to hear, too much. Pray for us, beloved Mary. Help us with your thoughts. Love from suffering Kahlil." So that letter in particular really touched me. So in terms of who wrote the prophet, Kahlil himself was the confessor and the one who mentioned to Mary in 1918 that what he wrote was the embodiment of all of the conversations they had. And so rest assured, if anyone has any doubt about who inspired the prophet, Kahlil puts them to rest. I understand someone says they're not sure of this. I don't know what to tell you other than Kahlil saying it himself. And when the book comes out, The Birth of the Prophet, in 2023, in time for the centennial anniversary, there will be a collection of all of their conversations, and you'll see in them the roots of the chapters of the prophet. And I have an example that I think is kind of illustrative of what we saw in the end and what Kahlil said. And I think we all know the chapter on children. And so we know in the prophet, Kahlil wrote, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts." And so in 1917, Mary and Kahlil are talking about a woman who refused to let her children see a nude statue in a museum. And Kahlil says, "From 7 to 13 is a very critical time in a child's life, and parents do very little usually to help the child through it. They don't understand. They want to make the child good after a certain pattern in their own minds. They want to make them reproductions with improvements of themselves. instead of putting them into relations with life. They aren't doing anything for the child's soul at this time. So this is what Kahlil said to Mary in 1917 about their conversation. So these conversations sure show up in the prophet itself. If you think about on marriage, drink not from one cup. This explains it. Because if Kahlil and Mary were to be together, then both of them would stop being Kahlil and Mary. And they think this is one of the messages of on marriage. Kahlil was an introvert who loved solitude. He worked best on his own. He was happy not seeing people for days at a time. Mary needed to be taken care of. And what would have happened, I think, in Kahlil's mind, is they would have lived among each other, but not with each other. And that wasn't enough for either of them. And he really believed Mary deserved the best. And he knew he could not give her what she deserved. And it was not in Kahlil to give Mary less than what she deserved. It just wouldn't be possible. And for Mary, I think she knew that it was impossible, but she tried anyway, because she knew that if she moved south, she would lose Kahlil, and she loved him so much. Mm-hmm. These aren't perfect people. These are complicated people, and it cost them both dearly in life. So I don't think it was easy, but I think they felt they had to do it.
Yeah. Did you get to talk about what you like to see being celebrated next year in Lebanon on time for the centennial anniversary of the Prophet?
We didn't. I did want to reassure everybody that Kahlil was the author of the quote that said that here the Prophet came from their conversations. But next year is the anniversary of the Prophet, and I plan on releasing this book that I call The Birth of the Prophet. So I went through all of the materials there, including Kahlil's letters, mm-hmm. and the draft chapters of the Prophet in some cases, and I'm accumulating them after a little bit of an introduction in their own words on how they worked. And so there are some examples with the madman. Yes. Now, the book is told entirely in their own words. I'm not in the book. Mm-hmm. And I think it's perfect to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the Prophet with Kahlil and Mary telling you how they did it. Mm-hmm. So we'll get that out next year. And in terms of participating in the celebration, any way I can participate, I will. I would love to, because it's energizing to sort of see people bring all of their love and energy and interest into this. So it's so rewarding just to see people respond to this and mm-hmm. go with it themselves. Mm. So it's incredibly enjoyable for me to see that. The second thing is, I think it's important, and if there was ever a time for people to hear what from Kahlil again, now's the time. I also think it would be just really sweet if they saw in 2023 what Kahlil was saying in 1912, 1914, 1916, 1918. I think that they'll run back and they'll read the Prophet again, and they'll love it as much, and maybe love it in new ways. So I think it will give people kind of a beginning of a new relationship with the Prophet over the next 100 years. So I think it's absolutely perfect. And then, there's another reason why I'd like to be involved. And that is, I kind of discovered late my Syrian roots, and Kahlil considered Lebanon and Syria as part of the same area. Mm-hmm. And, it's weird to spend your whole life not knowing where you're from. And so I feel like there might be a little bit of mischief with Kahlil kind of teasing me that for all of this hard work that you did in pushing it along, you're not just going to find your mother, but why don't you come and participate in some of these things too and see where you're from? And so I hope that happens. So I am looking forward to going to Lebanon next year. I just want to know how.
Yeah, well, Lebanon will always be hungry to know more and more about Gibran. He is, after all, as eternal to that land as are its cedars. May Ziadi was not mentioned, and I've asked you this question before in the book. Can you explain why, please?
I can't explain why. I can just tell you that,
Yeah.
I've read these materials and I haven't heard him mention May to Mary. And that's not surprising. I mean, there are many people in his life that he didn't mention much to Mary, but I can't give an answer that's satisfying.
And you have one from Princess Hayat Arslan is saying, if Mary is the one who wrote the Prophet, which she did not write the Prophet, she should have continued with another book. So maybe we want to clarify this one more time. She was not the one who wrote the Prophet.
Yeah, so she did not write the Prophet. She was the inspiration for Amitra, and from their conversations together, Kahlil managed to take their conversations and turn this into the topics of wisdom asked by the people of Orphalese, and then the answers from Al-Mustafa. So she never wrote the Prophet. Now, he did send her copies of the original versions, and she made some edits. And in some cases, the edits were somewhat significant, but really the content was all Kahlil's. And then around 1921, Kahlil had sort of a crisis. He didn't like what he wrote, so he rewrote most of the Prophet again himself, showing Mary what he had rewritten. So we should make that very clear, that there's the difference between inspiration and the writing. So
Lubna, since you opened the floor, sorry, Gibran wrote the Prophet years before Mary Haskell in Lebanon, like you previously said, Dalton. And I don't think Mary Haskell was the inspiration for El Mitra or the book. She may have helped editing it and rewriting the English of it, but not the idea. You are referring to quotes from here and there, but we are not sure how truthful these quotes are and how accurate, and if they existed or somebody just added them somewhere. So she was a big thing in Gibran's life, same as also my Ziadi or Micheline or other women, but she wasn't the one who inspired the Prophet.
So I'll flip that and I'll say the burden of proof is really on the people who would say she's not, because the written record is not only the written record, and it includes everything that Kahlil wrote, but the conversations themselves, the exact chapters marry almost to the conversations themselves. So I think it's, and we also have Mariana herself as kind of someone who's validating the role here. Now, Kahlil
He's no longer with us. She's no longer with us.
Right. So at some point, everyone is no longer with us. So when does the truth stay the truth, from the past? And I think that
why we are enforcing the idea that Mary Haskell inspired the book or, inspired Gibran. That's my concern.
Well, I think the reality is she did. And, Kahlil, as mentioned, he had this idea from 1899 when he was a student in Lebanon of a book of wisdom. And the way he describes it, it's sort of like, sort of men in a tavern talking and kind of challenging each other. But, there's no doubt, again, the inspiration of a book of wisdom comes from Kahlil's study of Christ, right? He
definitely,
he was completely influenced by what he admired about Christ, meeting common people and talking to them. And so the inspiration for a book of wisdom, without a doubt, came years before he met Mary. But the book itself, I think we might be arguing about semantics. The chapter content of the prophets, the actual subjects, we have enough documentation to say that Mary gave Kahlil the ingredients for him to cook a delicious meal. And I think nobody can say that she provided probably the best ingredients of them all, but Kahlil was the chef. So I think that, you know, there's no taking away from Kahlil by acknowledging Mary. And when Kahlil himself acknowledges Mary, I'm very careful. I'm very protective of this relationship, and I'm very protective of what Kahlil says. So if he says it with all due respect, I'm going to listen to Kahlil first. And that's what he said. So maybe there are things outside of what's in these materials, but I trust Kahlil. And I think he probably would love it if MEH got the credit she was due.
Yes, it's a matter of different interpretations, like it is interpretation of the Bible or other religious books, or this is not religious, but it's a matter of how we interpret what Gibran had said. A quick point, I won't take more time, but the Syria that Gibran referred to isn't the Syria that you originally are from, is the greater Syria al-Kubra, what the Arabs call Hilal al-Khasib, and this existed before the Turks and the Ottomans. Lebanon was just Mount Lebanon.
Yes.
So I'll return it to you, Lubna. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions and concerns. I think we have done pretty well, Dalton. What do you think? Should we just end it here?
If there are any other questions people have,
there are concerns here. There's one by William Nix. He says, in addition to his mother and sister, some other significant women in Gibran's life include Blanche Naft, who helped foster his writings and their publication, although her husband Alfred typically received much of the credit. The Union psychiatrist, Beatrice Hinkle, whose salons he attended in Washington, D.C., an artists community, Barbara Young, who wrote This Man from Lebanon about Gibran, and Meiziede in Cairo, who he never met, but with whom he also corresponded extensively.
Yeah, so people should know William had a critical role in the production of the movie version of The Prophet with Selma Hayek, and he is producing several Gibran projects, from plays to potentially documentaries. So he is as passionate himself about the stories of Gibran, because when you said who is the real Kahlil Gibran, there are many stories about the real Kahlil Gibran, and one of them is the women of Kahlil Gibran, right? Mm-hmm. Kamala, his mother, Mary Haskell, but there are others, and we talked about Micheline. So there are some neat stories about how when Knopf decided that they would be Gibran's publisher, it wasn't Alfred, that Blanche, his wife, had met Kahlil and was really intrigued by him, and that Alfred was kind of dragged into publishing it. So there were many women who found him fascinating. Barbara Young is a very controversial character because she came into Kahlil's life as sort of an acolyte. She was like a super fan, and she came in, Mary was already down south, and she was devoted to Kahlil, and she wrote the biography, The Man from Lebanon, but some of it really was kind of probably what she wished for and hoped for, but she spent years with him at the end of his life as his secretary. So there are a lot of these characters, and you know, he and I have talked about, it would be great to kind of follow up on that in another book or project.
Mm-hmm. And Gibran was also inspired by other schools of thoughts, and so the Baha'i faith is one of them, maybe. Yes,
and Islam as well, and Kahlil really was. He was very open-minded. He sought inspiration from many places. He sought inspiration from many artists, from many authors. But you know, in addition to being Lebanese, Kahlil was highly spiritual. And really, he would have been remarkably at home, I think, with leaders from a few different religions. And if I remember correctly, he sketched one of the leaders, and this person he was supposed to have been on the Titanic, and he preferred to go on a slower moving boat because he wanted to be on the ocean more. And he turned down a seat on the Titanic, but there's no doubt that they talked about their faith while he was sketching him. So it's a fascinating guy who's open to a lot.
Well, thank you, Dalton. We're going to have to end the session here. Dalton Einhorn, thank you so much for sharing with us so many unheard stories about Gibran and about yourself. This information from the archive is absolutely fascinating. And to think that it's only represents a small portion of it, right, is very exciting. Today's event will be uploaded to my YouTube channel and shared with all of you. Unheard Stories is a monthly event. It falls on the last Saturday of every month. My guest next month will be coming from the realm of the class of classical music. George Thom is an award-winning composer and concert pianist who has achieved international recognition and fame at a young age. He studied composition and orchestration with Conrad Pope and Christopher Young in Vienna. At the age of 20, his music was performed side by side with perennial opuses of Beethoven, Mozart, and Verdi by the San Remo Symphony Orchestra conducted by Maestro Francesco Attardi. Mr. Thom wrote the music of Enough, Lebanon's Darkest Hour, the Australian film that was primed in the Cannes Film Festival. Thom is also the commissioned composer of Pinocchio, an Italian ballet premiered recently by Balletto del Sud at the Opera di Lecce with the participation of award-winning choreographer Freddy Franzutti. At present, he is entrusted with many film scores in Hollywood and is working on international classical music projects. Please don't forget to register. You don't want to miss it. To watch past events and know about our future ones, you can follow me on social media. Thank you for bringing us into your home and making us part of your Saturday. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubna.
Thank you.
Ahlan.